You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by Scott Carpenter, the author of Paris Lost and Found, a memoir of love. He's here to discuss a word that evokes a host of themes related to the things we remember, but is not, oddly enough, the word the French use to refer to individual memories. Mémoire. I am very excited to welcome you back to the podcast, Scott. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Happy to be here.
And you are here on the tails of what was I'm sure, a big job for you. You've just released a new book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Be happy to. So a few years ago, I released a book called French Like Moi, sort of a memoir of anecdotes about living in Paris. And what I've just released now is a new one. Just got actually the copies because we're just releasing it. Paris Lost and Found, a memoir of love. So this is the new book that picks up a little bit on the stories and the situation from French Like Moi, which was telling tales about living in Paris over the course of a number of years. Paris Lost and Found takes a somewhat different tack a little bit later in life, and it tells a more sort of sobering tale, still laced with humor, bizarrely, that has to do with what it's like to lose a loved one. So it starts with the tale of my wife sinking into early onset Alzheimer's disease at the beginning, and what that was like being in a city like Paris, and then easing from that into what Paris was like when I was coming out of that experience, which was Paris devastated by COVID, and then shows what it's like for the city to come roaring back to life after that very bleak period, which was also the period at which I came roaring back to life. So some new opportunities, some new experiences, and ultimately a happy ending.
I mean, I think it's amazing that you're able to tell that story with so much humor and heart. And I think it's just a testament to you as a writer and as a storyteller. And I'm excited to have you here to talk about this word today because it is threaded through your book, as we're going to talk about a little bit later on the podcast. But before we get into that, I want to jump in with this idea of mémoire, because mémoire is a false friend, as so many of the words that we talk about on this podcast are. But it's a false friend that does sometimes mean what you think it means. And then sometimes you have to use other words to get at the meaning that you mean. So it's frustrating in the sort of all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares kind of mindset. But basically, when we're talking about mémoire, sometimes we say mémoire and sometimes we say souvenir.
Right.
Give us sort of a global look at what we generally mean when we say mémoire in this context, because there are other contexts, and what we mean when we say souvenir.
Yeah, so this is a great topic. And I think in translation, all friends are false, right? That there are no perfect translations. There's always a little bit of slippage between the language. But this is a particularly subtle one, I think. And to start, in a sense, with the easy one, I would say souvenir is identifiable by all English speakers because it's a word that has crossed the Atlantic. And we think of it as that trinket or that bauble that is connected to a particular place or a particular experience. You know, the mini Eiffel Tower, the coin with the face of Napoleon on it from the Invalides, that sort of thing. And the job there is still linked to memory, right? The job of these objects is to trigger a memory or to somehow hold that memory. And that's true in the French word souvenir as well, right? That exists as a noun, which can mean these objects. But it also, as a noun, refers to a specific event, a specific memory, a story or experience, right, that we have recorded somehow, and is tied then, of course, to the verb se souvenir, which is that act of remembering this specific thing. Mémoire is a little bit different because it's referring not so much to that specific event or the thing that we're remembering, but that function, the capability or ability to remember. So I think of it as being a little bit like if you put this in the context of a computer, that you have a hard drive, and the hard drive is where all of these things are collected. The hard drive is mémoire. And in fact, it's the word that is used for computer memory in French is mémoire. And then the various data files that are stored on it are the various souvenirs that we are able to call back to mind. So that for me is really the big distinction. And I think, as we'll see, there are some other little rabbit holes that we can go down because they open up into many different areas.
Yeah, and I think that distinction that you're drawing is really interesting. Like, as you were talking, I was thinking about how you would never say I had a mémoire, like a memory, but you have
Right.
my global memory that makes me me, and then you have many, many souvenirs that make up your memory.
Yep, exactly.
And as someone who's also lost a loved one to Alzheimer's, I remember what it's like to sort of see that cohesive whole of everything that you are kind of starting to become a little bit more fluid. And this idea that you bring up in your book of sort of this juxtaposition between someone that you love losing their memory and losing a little bit of themselves in this city, which is in some ways a capital of memory. Can you tell me a little bit about how that works in your storytelling and what that meant for you when you were comparing those two ideas?
Yeah. So I think it is particularly poignant to discuss this in the context of Paris, right? Paris has this special status as being the city that everybody remembers before they have even gone there, right? Everybody knows the city ahead of time. They've seen it in movies, in books. They've watched Emily in Paris. They see it, the Eiffel Tower imprinted on handbags. It's really everywhere. It's part of popular culture at the same time that it's part of high culture. And there are such memorable aspects of the city. The city was basically rebuilt in the 19th century to become a locus of memory, right? To have these incredible views, the spectacular visions that you see when you turn the corner and suddenly there's an opera house at the end of the boulevard, that sort of thing. They imprint memories to such an extent that the very specific and idiosyncratic kinds of monuments that we have in Paris are recognizable and memorable because of their distinctiveness. So you'd have to be really far gone to look at the Eiffel Tower and say, what is that thing? Right? These things really stick. So in that kind of context, for me, it was very poignant to watch my wife, who had lived with me for many years in Paris. We raised kids partly in Paris, to see the tiles of that mosaic starting to fall down or become untethered. Sometimes it was that capacity for memory that was being lost, but the individual memories were still somehow there, but they became dislocated and moved into different places and then would vanish entirely. And then the ability to create new memories was lost. So that was particularly devastating, I think, in that particular situation. And one of the things that I recount in the book is the last trip that we took. So we'd come back to the States for the period of her as she was declining. But with my sister-in-law, my wife's sister, we went on one last trip, somehow thinking that I think this was something we both understood, but didn't really tell one another, my sister-in-law and I, that the re-entry into Paris, because it's such a memorable place, would help to kind of consolidate what remained of her memory. Of course, that failed. The city's actions on memory are not going to be able to stand up to the test of human existence, but that was sort of the effort.
And how does your sort of return to Paris feel in terms of interacting with Paris in a place that not only is this memorable place for so many people that you don't know, but was so memorable for you in your life?
Yeah, good question. You know, when I returned to Paris, it was after that chapter of my life, right? And then returning as COVID was, we were sort of the after effects of COVID. The city was a very bleak place. A lot of things that I attached memories to, including people, had vanished. I have friends who moved from the city definitively during that period, and they said they're not going to do it. So the city was recognizable, but it was also very, very different. So in terms of memory, it was a bit of a game of trying to rediscover the things that were still there, that were still anchored in my particular memory, but also beginning to fashion new ones as the city reinvented itself.
Yeah. I think that also sort of paves the way for one of the questions that I wanted to discuss with you, which is one of the ways that I think is really fascinating, or the things that I think is really fascinating about the way that the French use the word mémoire, is that you can have a collective memory. And this idea of sort of a shared and common memory, I think that kind of exists in other cultures, but I hear it used a lot in the French language a lot, which makes me think, when you hear a phrase used over and over again, it feels like it has a specific resonance in that culture. Is that something that you've noticed, this idea of a collective memory or even being responsible as a community or as a society for remembering things?
Yeah. So I think memory is terrifically important to French culture. Of course, memory is important to every culture, right? There is this sense that we have some shared history and therefore we have some shared memories. I think that is what sort of glues people together in some ways. But we also see cultures that become somewhat unglued because their sense of a shared identity and a shared past is not as strong. In France, this notion of the mémoire collective, this collective experience and shared memories of the past, is quite strong, I think. And I think it's partly due to the way that the culture is so centralized. And so France is a much more centralized country than, for example, the United States, which has this sort of federation of states with they're all acting somewhat autonomously. Whereas in France, everything is sort of governed mostly by Paris, right? And there is this notion of a central education. There is a national education in France the way that there is not in the United States, which means that everybody is learning pretty much the same curriculum. And there was this dream in the early 20th century that one could achieve this state where every school child in France would be reading the same page of the same history manual on the same day. They never achieved that, thank goodness, right? There's more variety than that. But that gives you a sense of this idea of sameness across space and across age and culture that exists in France that doesn't exist elsewhere. There's a historian named Pierre Nora who helped to assemble a great collection of essays, fantastic collection in several volumes called Lieux de Mémoire, Sites of Memory. And what he's looking to do in this collection, where a number of historians and sociologists participated, contributed essays, is to identify those particular touchstones of French culture that are not maybe universally shared, but are very broadly shared. And some of them you might expect. It might be, Charles de Gaulle. There is an essay on the Eiffel Tower. But it's also very small, mundane things. The baguette, the institution of the cafe, all sorts of small, ordinary things, also elements that reach into the spiritual life. So the notion of the cathedral, not any specific cathedral, but the Gothic cathedrals that are sprinkled around France that people become familiar with and then they have that sort of shared experience of cathedrals. And it's everything from the everyday experience to the spiritual, to the political, to almost any facet that you can think of. And there are many of these in French culture. So I think that's a really terrific example of collective memory. There's a philosopher from the end of the 19th century, Ernest Renan, who spent a long time trying to think about what it is that pulls together a society, what holds us together. And he looked at all these various things, like, is it a common language? It's like, well, no, because you have countries where many languages are spoken. Look at Switzerland. Is it having some sense of stable borders? No, because borders are often changing, and we see that all of the time. Is it a common religion? No, it's not that. So he goes through all of these various things, and what he settles on is the notion of collective memory. It's shared memories that really bind people together, and in particular, he says, memories of suffering. So societies, cultures that have suffered together really have this very strong sense of collective experience, a kind of collective nostalgia sometimes of the before or the after of traumatic events. And I think that is more powerful in France than it is in many other places.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? Don't miss This Takes You Beyond the Typical and the Obvious, with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Every Monday, you'll get 20 to 35 new Parisian events with descriptions, links, and all the details sent directly to your inbox. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Sign up for Don't Miss This on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.
Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. And I think what you said about Paris being the central locus of so much of that is really essential to that. You do obviously have these events, like I can think, the French Revolution, people have a lot of storytelling around that, or even, World War II and the occupation, people have a lot of storytelling around that. But one thing you also notice in Paris, when you were talking about these places, is France being a nominally secular society. We delve into that on the laïcité episode if anybody wants to hear why I say nominally, but we are a nominally secular society. We do have a lot of churches, but we also have a lot of buildings that were churches that become monuments almost to memory. So I'm thinking like specifically of the Pantheon in Paris. I'm sure there are many others that we could come up with, but places where it is sort of the knowledge and the memory and the collective consciousness that's being held to the same esteem as, a lieu de culte, religious place would be in many other countries.
Yeah, I love that idea, and I love that specific example, right? Because the Pantheon, the Panthéon, is that place where luminaries across the centuries have been, a little selection of them, have been buried. And so it's a kind of a graveyard. There are graveyards in Paris as well. You think of something like Père Lachaise, which is another place for keeping memories. Right? That's the function of a grave, of a tombstone, to have this little relic and trace of a person's passing. Those are individual memories. They're, not necessarily small, but more familial memories. And then the Pantheon is for the big family, right? It's for the family of French culture. And these are, in a sense, the mothers and fathers of French science and culture writ large, who are represented there. And it does show something special about France, right? We don't have the equivalent, I think, in the US of a space where these collective founding figures, right, have been enshrined.
Absolutely. So one thing that I remember as a French learner when I was first learning French that totally baffled and really frustrated me, and I think I'm not alone in this, is that you'll misgender a noun and the person you're talking to will pretend they can't understand you. And then I remember the first day that a different foreigner was talking to me and misgendered a noun. And I was like, what? And I did the same thing that had been annoying me the entire time I'd been learning French, because the reality is once you get those gendered noun things in your head, they are, unbreakable. And with Mémoire, this is a particularly apt sort of thing to know about, because using the wrong, in quotes, or using a different gender for the noun can actually change its meaning, right? So there's mémoire singular masculine, mémoire singular feminine, and mémoire plural.
Right.
Can you clear that fog for us? What do those three things mean?
Yeah. So first, what I want to do is sympathize with that situation of all foreign, learners of French as a second language, right, who are struggling with gender, and that experience that you described of using the wrong gender, and then suddenly people have no idea what you're speaking about. And it always makes me think of what they say of beehives, right? That if the bees go out, and if you just move that hive 6 inches, they'll come back, they'll never find it. Because it's just been, moved a little squinch to the side. And that's a little bit what happens with language. Like you've just changed a tiny little thing. You think it ought not to matter, but sometimes it matters a lot. And that's sometimes the case here. So to clarify a little bit, this notion of mémoire that we were speaking of before, collective memory, the faculty of memory, things like that, that's mémoire in the feminine. It's la mémoire collective, things like that. But it does also exist in the masculine, mémoire, which is in part this, right? So this is a memoir, and it can be in the masculine singular. It's more often in the masculine plural. So Flaubert had a little book called Mémoire, in the plural, Mémoire d'un fou, Memories of a Madman. but it's a memoir of a madman. And we see that frequently. And then there's this other use of mémoire that is a little more unusual. Mémoire in the masculine meaning a kind of report, or sometimes in English we might call it a thesis. So if you write a master's, if you complete a master's and you have a master's thesis to write, that would be referred to as a mémoire. I was like, why? What in the masculine? Why would that be referred to as mémoire? What connection to memory? The idea is that these are longish reports, and they are mostly supposed to be compilations of knowledge. So sort of a way of recording knowledge. In recording, we know, especially if we think of the Spanish, recordar means to remember, right? So remembering, compiling, and recording are all connected in that. Of course, as you move into the PhD level or the doctoral level, then it's no longer a mémoire. Then it's the thèse or the thesis. And that has a different sort of resonance, because the thèse is not just a compilation of knowledge. It's proposing something new. It's a more philosophical treatise. And in English, we'll also use the word dissertation, which has this origin from Latin of examination and discussion, right? These are richer, larger ideas that are being presented. And the mémoire is somehow a little bit more settled, which is tied, I guess, to the last meaning I would evoke with mémoire, which is a simple kind of memorandum, especially in accounting, where you might turn in a list of receipts referred to as a mémoire. And it's, again, just a way of recording things that were spent, things that happened. So there's this idea that it should be more material in a sense.
Okay, so lots of different ways to use this word.
Unfortunately, yes.
And so I did a master's here, and I kept misgendering my mémoire and calling it ma mémoire, and I think I confused a lot of people. So, but life goes on. So I think one, there's lots of different ways that memory works, as I'm sure you saw firsthand, and as I'm sure you detail in your book. So anybody who wants to learn a bit more about what that experience was like and to get, sort of a view into your experience with that should definitely get a copy of Paris Lost and Found. We'll be putting a link in the description in the show notes. But with all of the sort of strange ways that memory can work and the way that it's connected to our other senses, you smell some, my family moved every single year when I was a kid. So I walk past a place where they're renovating and I'm like, it's the smell of home. In France, we have, though, a very specific mémoire that makes a lot of sense given the culture that we have, which is the mémoire de ventre, the stomach memory. So most of the time when we talk about mémoire de ventre in French, we use the expression the Madeleine de Proust, so evoking the Madeleine dipped in tea that sort of sets us on the journey of the 6-volume Proustian novel. But I'm curious from your perspective, having spent so much time here and having navigated, the loss of the big mémoire, what were the ways in which food and memory remained linked for you? And how do you see French society as having a particular link between food and memory that we might not see in other cultures?
Yeah, well, that's a deep and thorny question, right? I mean, there are many different connections. You bring up the Proustian example, and that is famous for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is that it's an example, one of the earliest examples in literature of what is called the involuntary memory, mémoire involontaire. So you're not looking for it. Sometimes we're sitting around scratching our heads, what was the name of that person? I guess I'll look it up on Wikipedia. But then sometimes memories befall us. Right? Sometimes we're not looking for them and suddenly they happen. And they often come in through not the front door, but the side door. The front door is when we're really searching for them. That's what we're focused on. We're trying to find something. But when other senses are at play, and especially taste and smell, they're able to short circuit some of that more conscious operation, and they slip in these unexpected ways. In my neighborhood, in Paris, I live in the 13th, and in my neighborhood, there are, as in so many neighborhoods in Paris, shops lining the streets, so I can go right downstairs, and in my building on the ground floor, there's a bakery. Across the street, there's a fruit and vegetable stand. A couple of shops down, there's the butcher. Then all of a sudden, that's the cheese shop. And so one of the things that happens is that when you're just out for a stroll, you encounter smells in a way that you don't in any other city that I've spent time in. And they are wafting out onto the sidewalk. Many of these shops have open doors. Sometimes, like the fruit and vegetable shops, have stands out in front, or you're going through one of the open air markets, which are springing up on different days in different neighborhoods and different times. And it's really a feast for the senses. And because you're not looking for them, you're actually going to the post office, or you're trying to get your shoe repaired or something like that. You're focused on something else. You go past these shops and suddenly, boom, something is sparked. Sometimes they're famous sorts of universally experienced events. The event of smelling fresh baguette. You get these maybe 3 times a day when the fresh baguettes are coming out of the ovens, and suddenly that aroma is so powerful. It may not be calling to mind a very specific experience, but more kind of a collection of experiences. And what you referred to as the Mémoire du ventre is partly that, right? It's all of these wonderful sensations that connect us to other experiences. But in particular, they might be tied to meals. So this idea of the stomach having its own kind of memory, it's tied to the meals that you had, the food that you ate, but then especially the things attached to that, which are the company that you shared the meal with, the wine that you had at that meal, the particular aroma of that wine when it was first poured, those sorts of things. And it becomes one of these great networks of memories. So it's not just one thing, it's one thing connected to another, and then there's this web that you suddenly find yourself enmeshed in. I think that's one of the particular joys of living in Paris, is being taken by surprise as you're going down the street and you encounter something that you're not looking for. And sometimes that's in the form of aromas and sometimes taste.
Amazing. Well, you've inspired me to go on a search for new memories in Paris. I just feel like it's a completely different way of looking at the city, and I thank you for that. Anybody who wants to gain more of Scott's wisdom should definitely pick up a copy of the book. Thank you so very much for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.